we know
Who?
Alex Israel?
No.
About with Brownfield? He's speaking for Sophie Valley.
What?
He's teaching from Israel.
Ari Hartford's in the Washington Journal today.
And what?
They're talking about how this war is creating tension and
Hello. Hello.
I feel like there's a Yoni connection.
What?
Downtown.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome everyone. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to come in and join the Zoom, but welcome to Rabbi Israel, and I'll give you an official welcome in a few minutes. We'll maybe wait 1 or 2 more minutes.
Great.
All right, so this is from
Just a reminder to everyone to mute themselves when they're not speaking, if possible. Ariella, I met someone who is good friends with you. Now her name is flying away from me. Mira, she was a resident with you maybe at the same time.
Yeah, she's
Very
my
happy to see you.
co-chief. Yeah.
Yeah.
When did you meet her? Oh, in Ann Arbor.
I was at a Chabad challah bake last night.
Oh, nice. Oh my gosh, amazing.
Yes. She said, well, we
That's
tried to get them to
amazing.
move here. I said, me too.
Yeah, that's funny. And hi, Rev Alex. I don't know if you remember me. I was your student in 2003.
Well, that's so only a little bit ago. Right.
Yeah,
Remind me of your last name, because I'm looking at your face. And
Nadler, Ariella
okay, so
Nadler.
that's right. Okay,
I was good friends
thank
with
you.
Elisa Pizer. That might ring a bell
Of
also.
course, of
Yeah.
course, of course. People do change a little bit in 20 years, but you
Yes.
haven't changed that much.
Yeah, it's been a change.
Okay, lovely to see you.
It's exciting to be able to learn Torah from you again. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's exciting to be here. Really, really exciting.
I know there are some more people who will join, but we can get started. I want to be respectful of your time. There are a few people who have been regulars. This has been a series. You're finishing out a 5-part series for us, which has been really, really lovely. And there are several people who join every week. So I'm sure that they're on their way. Maybe I'll just post one more reminder in our WhatsApp system. I went to Harova the year that Ariella went to Bravo.
Oh,
So I
wow.
did not get the chance to learn from you then, but I'm
I
glad
think I'd already, I was part of the, one might call it founding group of Harova, with my chavruta of David Milston. And then I think in 98, I moved on from there. So yeah, I missed you by a few years.
yeah.
It actually cracks me up that the whole chevra is still there. You know, Rabbi Shames and Rav Milston and Rav Yonatan, Rabbi Berg, and they're all, and Yakira, they're all still there. Like, I don't know, I have this 8-year itch. I have to move on, you know, every once in a while. So,
Wow, that's amazing. I can't believe all those people are still there.
they really are. They really are still there. It's
Wow.
quite something. Rabbi Bailey, he's still there. It's just, it's quite something.
Wow, amazing. That is something. All right, well, let's get started.
Okay, let's
we know
begin.
that people will come up. Here come some of the regulars.
Okay.
And I will introduce you, and then I'll turn it over
Can
to
you
you.
just make me a co-host so I can share or?
Yes, I certainly can. I can also post the I can upload it to the chat, and I can share my screen if you'd prefer. Whatever you prefer is fine with me.
I'll share the screen. It's not because then I can highlight and everything.
Perfect. Make co-host. There we go. Hey, Adrian. Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, welcome to our 5th and final Torah from Israel Scholar Series lunch. And we're so lucky to finish on such a high note with Rabbi Alex Israel. Rabbi Israel is an author, Tanakh teacher, and international lecturer, a teacher at Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi, Midrashet Lindenbaum, and records a daily 929 podcast, which I greatly enjoy myself. I recommend it. I have many of Rabbi Israel's books on my shelf, and we do at the shul as well. So I know that he is well known. Rabbi Israel lives in Alon Shvut. And so we are so grateful to learn Torah from you, and also just to hear anything you want to share about the experience of being in Israel right now. And this is for us to listen and Rabbi Alex to teach. So welcome and thank you.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much, Rabbanit Yael, and it is a delight to be with you and share a bit of Torah. We're going to talk Torah, but if you want to talk about Israel, we can do that too. We're a bit in the thick of it. What I mean by that is I have a son currently in Gaza, who is in an infantry unit. They've been now over 2 weeks in Gaza. And this week was we don't get any information. They don't have their phones. But we get once a day we get information from the sort of logistics coordinator of the unit. So, you know, this week we know that he's in. The way it works is that you have a pluga, which is about 100 soldiers, and 3 plugot make a gedud, make a sort of battalion. So my son happens to be in pluga Bet, Pluga Gimel, and in Pluga Bet, the deputy, whatever you call it, Mafaked, actually was killed this week, and in my son's Gdud, two soldiers were actually wounded, which has sort of brought things. If things weren't a little scary, they've become a little scarier. Having said that, it certainly seems like they're doing amazing work. When I saw my son a week ago, he was very unable to share his experience. They were still very much in the middle of it. They came out for literally 18 hours to sort of decompress, and then they went back in on Shabbat. But it's clear that they're full of motivation, the guys, and the army. We can argue about a lot of things, whether they work well in Israel, but I think Tzahal has really excelled itself in this situation. And because my son's there, I'm constantly sort of watching reports and listening, and have back channels to learn a little bit. And Baruch Hashem, first of all, they're being very careful, but second of all, they're being very successful. So that's a little bit that I can share. And if any of you, it's been since the war, some of these weeks have been pretty tough. A lot of us are trying to volunteer and do things. So unfortunately, this week also, I don't know if you heard about a guy who was an educator in Israel called Yossi Hershkovitz, and who was killed in a over last Shabbat. I happened to work very closely with his wife, and just stories about him and his educational vision and his ideals are really, really astounding. And you read about each different chayal who passed away, who was killed in war, and you're astounded more and more. So maybe I'll just mention one. On Sunday, I actually had to go to 2 halvayot. I haven't been to any. But last Sunday, I went to Yossi's funeral, because and there were thousands of people. I mean, thousands. But I also went to a different one of a friend of my son, I've actually got 3 boys in the army, and 1 son-in-law, and 6 nephews. It's a bit crazy. It's been intense. But that's the situation of the country. There's nothing you can say. The guys my age are all complaining, why aren't they in? Like they're and so we were at a kid from my son's class, my son who's 22, was killed in Gaza. My son, they were schoolmates, so my son was actually released from the army to attend the Halvaya, and he said, "Dad, will you come with?" And this kid was from an Ethiopian family. They live in Karmei Tzur in Gush Etzion. And what's amazing is that on Chavtet Cheshvan is the date on the calendar that they call the Sigd. It's the day that the Ethiopian community commemorate their long journey to Eretz Israel. And in fact, what they actually do is they go to a mountain. Usually they do it in Talpiot, on the Tayelet, overlooking Har HaBayit, because for all those years, their tradition was that they just yearned to reach Yerushalayim and Eretz Israel. And they go with their kesim, with their religious leaders, and it's actually for them, it's the anniversary in certain ways of Har Sinai. They renew the covenant between them and God. And the father of this boy who had been killed, the bereaved father, got up at the Halvaya, and he said, tonight is the Sigd. And he said that because of the war, the public commemoration of the Sigd, because it's festive and because the parties, all the celebrations have been curtailed. He said, but here we are renewing our covenant, except it's not a covenant, it's a covenant of blood. That was what he said. And one of the amazing, after having had a very, very 9 months in Israel where we were fighting with one another and where there was a huge demonstrations in the street, there is such a palpable sense of unity, of love, of togetherness, of support, support for the soldiers, support from neighbors, support for people who have. There's something like 100,000 Israelis who have moved from their homes. Anyone who's within 5 kilometers of the northern border, and anyone who is sort of in the area around Gaza, they've all been asked to leave their homes, and the government has found them places in guest houses and kibbutzim and hotels, But the sense of support, my daughter, one of the ways she makes money as a student is by cutting hair. So when she has a spare day, she goes to one of these hotels and she cuts hair for free, does hairstyling, highlight, and it's just also really interesting to hear what stories she could come back with. But she's not the only one. Everybody, I've got a friend of mine. He's a high-tech guy, sold his last company for $50 million. I said to him, do you do anything interesting this week? He said, yeah, I've been picking avocados down near Gaza. I said to him, wow. I said, how do you do that? He says, well, there's this organization called Achim Leneshek. Until recently, their whole efforts were there to bring down the government and to oppose the legal reforms. And now all of their efforts are to getting volunteers to help with agriculture in the north, in the south. And so it's just really a sense of mobilization, a sense of togetherness, and a sense of it's quite amazing. And I got to say, I was very heartwarmed to see the huge rally in Washington, D.C. this week. It's not only within Israel; it's wrapping across the world. And I really wonder what the long-term effects of this are going to be. I'll just maybe mention one last thing, and then we'll get to the shir, which I hope will also somehow connect. But I follow a few like leading Israeli personalities, some of whom are, aren't your classic religious Israelis. So there's one woman called Maya Dayan Tevet. She's an author. She's exceedingly Chiloni, and she happens to be a visiting professor of literature at San Diego University. Now, she's exceedingly Chiloni, and she even said that on her last sabbatical, she was in Canada and she didn't meet one Jew the whole time she was on her shlichut. She didn't want to. And she said suddenly she was so shocked by the lack of sympathy in liberal circles being in San Diego University that she suddenly found herself seeking out the Jewish community more than she could ever have imagined. And speaking in shuls, she said, I never visited a shul for God knows how long. And last week she wrote a whole post about what it means to have a Jewish neshama, and that she walks through the street and suddenly her eyes lock with somebody. She's, oh, that's one of mine. And this sense that, maybe people are, what Rav Soloveitchik talks about, the covenant of fate, suddenly rediscovering our covenant of fate. And I wonder what will happen, please God, after this covenant of fate, how we will somehow translate that to a covenant of destiny, how we're going to hopefully move with unity to a moment where we can take all this togetherness, I hope, and channel it in good directions, and channel it in a direction where we can realize that we can build our future together instead of always arguing about our various different identities. So that's all a few of my thoughts in the current moment here in Israel. So the idea is to get a little bit of a vantage point. That's a little bit of my perspective. So let's learn something from Parashat Shavua. First, I'm really delighted to be with you here. I'm going to share. Before I share my screen, we'll go off screen and we'll see what we can do off the screen, and then we'll share some words. So I want to really talk about Yitzchak Avinu, because I always feel that Yitzchak gets a bit of a bad rap. If you ask an average class of any age, you say to them, choose your favorite Av between Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. A lot of people put up their hands for Avraham, a lot of people for Yaakov, and not that many for Yitzchak. Yitzchak really is in many ways in the shadows. Avraham, there are so many chapters about him, from chapter 12 all the way to chapter 25. He's the major figure in virtually every chapter. Same thing with Yaakov, a long life, exciting stories of overcoming against his brother, over Lavan, against his brother again, his children, huge, amazing, stories about Yaakov. And Yitzchak, we get the sense of his being very, very passive, very, very in the shadows. If you go through Yitzchak's life, obviously the stories of his birth, he's obviously passive. In the story of the Akedah, he doesn't seem to play a starring role. He barely gets a word in, and it's Avram's test. Ve'Elohim nisat Avraham. You're probably aware that in the Quran, It's a test which Yitzchak is at the center, but not in our Chumash. And then we have the story of his mother dying. He doesn't even feature. The story of his marriage. There's this classic, what Robert Alter in the Art of Biblical Narrative calls a type scene, a typological scene. When two people get married and they meet by the well, right? The well is the equivalent of, the coffee machine at work, right? So, that's where people sort of sit and chat. And so you have the classic story of Yaakov. He sees a cute-looking girl by the well, and suddenly he finds superhuman strength, and he, waters the flocks. That's what you do, right? Another story which seems to fit the pattern. Moshe Rabbeinu sees some girls being picked on by the well. Maybe he likes one of them, and he gets involved, and hey presto, he marries one of them, right? So you got the figure of the hero who is always the person who releases the tension by the well, and then he actually is the person who draws the water for the damsel in distress, and then he's the heroic character. Yitzchak and Rivka, well, the betrothal story happens by a well. Yitzchak's not even there, and the person who's doing all the hubbub of activity and who actually draws the water for the man is going to be Rivka. So Rivka is actually playing in the male role, so to speak, and Yitzchak's totally absent. So we're already getting this figure that Yitzchak isn't quite our stellar, character. Story of the brachot, right? The story of the brachot. I can only relate a childhood, I don't know what you call it, a childhood impression. I don't know if you have like impressions from your like Chumash classes when you were 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, right? Which sit in your brain still. But I remember as a child thinking about Yitzchak, and I used to imagine him on my neighbor's. My neighbor used to have a living room with a couch, a low couch, and then a coffee table and a huge TV. I always used to imagine Yitzchak sitting with dark glasses on their couch, just having TV dinners, right? People bring him his dinner, right? Because that's the impression you get in the brachot scene. He seems very feeble. He seems out of it, and he can't see, and people are bringing him his dinner. He doesn't need to be able to get food for himself. And that's a pretty pathetic and sad image of Yitzchak. And you could argue that, okay, there's nothing so bad about that. But I would say this, that, when we say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, what we seem to be saying is that there is a power, in Kabbalah, Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gevura, Yaakov is Tiferet. In other words, what they're saying is these are 3 legs of a table. Each of them have an independent spiritual capacity. And when we paint Yitzchak in such pallid terms, in such non-existent terms, so what are we writing Yitzchak out of the script? Now, I will say that I have heard people who say that. Many years ago, I'll maybe talk a little bit more about him in terms of Israel, but many years ago, one of my sons is 22, and his name is Hillel Yitzchak, and his Shalom Zachar was on Parshat Toldot, and we had the Shalom Zachar in Alon Shvut, and Rav Yaakov Meidan came there, and I asked him to give a Dvar Torah. He didn't know that I was going to call him Hillel Yitzchak. In a minute, I'll explain why I called him Yitzchak at the end of this year. But first of all, my grandfather's name was Yitzchak, so that would be a good reason. But he actually gave a whole Dvar Torah about how really there are only 2 avot. There's Avram and Yaakov, and Yitzchak is the hyphen. He didn't know what we were going to call this child. I never told him that was. But I feel Yitzchak's got to mean something. In other words, Yitzchak has to have his own independent personality. And that's what I want to really try and talk about with the few minutes that we have together, to try and put a bit of color in the cheeks of Yitzchak, and to try and explain what his energy might be. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look. I will say that there is only one chapter where Yitzchak is really the major, the subject of the chapter, rather than the the secondary character, and that is Perek Chavav, chapter 26, which is the centerpiece of our parsha. So let's first I'll reinforce what I've been saying about Yitzchak, but then I'm going to go in a different direction. So first of all, if you look at the first of all, look at the opening line of our parsha. Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak. Right? This sense that Yitzchak can't be mentioned alone. Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak. What can you tell me about him? Oh, Avraham gave birth to him. He doesn't get his own look in. When you look through Perek Chavav, which I hope you can see on the screen, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. And what I've sort of done is I've tried to put in red all of the bits which deal with Yitzchak, but Yitzchak in reference to Avraham. Let me explain. Well, maybe even the first line. Vahira baretz milvad harav harishon asher haya bimei Avraham. There was a famine, other than the famine which was in Abraham's time, and Yitzchak went to Avimelech, Melech Pishtim Gerara, and then God says to him, don't go down to Egypt. In other words, Avraham went down to Egypt, but you don't do that. You don't go down to Egypt. So first of all, what I'm trying to say is that it appears that Avraham is constantly a reference point here. Avraham is a reference point, and let's take a look at a bit more. He says in Pasuk Gimel, verse 3, okay, reside in this land, Gor ba'aretz hazot, ve'heyem chava varachecha. I'll be with you and I'll bless you. Ki lecha u'lezaracha netenet kol ha'aratzot el. Well, that's nice. That's the bracha of Abraham, because to you and to your offspring I will give you these lands. But look what it says. V'akimoti et hashvua asher nishbati l'Avram avicha. But I'll fulfill the promise that I gave to Avram. In other words, this isn't looking so great for Yitzchak. You're going to get a second-hand promise. You're going to get Avraham's promise. And then, interestingly enough, I'll make it a bit bigger, maybe it'll help people see it. And I will give you all of these lands. Why? Look at verse 5. Inasmuch as Abraham obeyed me, everything in Yitzchak's life is referred back to Avraham. If you look in the next story, what does she do? He goes to Avimelech, and what does he say? She's my sister, right? Have you heard that story before? Yeah. And then if you look further down, again, I've put all the bits in red, which are the relevant bits that I want to focus on in this particular section. Vayeshev Yitzchak lived in Gerar, vayachbor et borot hamayim asher chafru bimei Avraham. Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death, and he gave them the same names that his father had given them. Hello, Yitzchak, anything original about you, please? Like what's going on? And this doesn't end, because later on in the chapter, God appears to him. If you look here in verse 24, Pasuk Chaf Daled, and he says that God appears to him, Balayla hu vayoma anochi Elohei Avraham avicha, I'm the God of your Abraham, your father. Al tirak yitcha anochi overachti v'yabeti et zaracha ba'avor Avraham avdi. Okay, once again, everything in his life is because of Avraham. Maybe I'll even mention the last thing, which is he calls the place, he moves to Beersheba, and he calls it Beersheba ad hayom hazeh. But if you remember, who called it Beersheba before him? We read on Rosh Hashanah, Avraham. In other words, Yitzchak seems like so much of his life is in the shadow of his great father Abraham. And what exactly are we going to do with this? So in order to explain this, I want to take a look at the writings of Rav Steinsaltz. And Rav Steinsaltz, in his famous book, Biblical Images, maybe I'll just mention a little bit of the background of the book. Rav Steinsaltz, I imagine most people have heard of. Rav Steinsaltz, well, I should even go back. There is an Israeli radio channel called Galei Tzahal. Galei Tzahal is the news channel. Gal Galatz is the music channel. That's army radio, but it's really mainstream radio. And they always, after the 8 o'clock news, they have a lecture. they call it the Broadcast University, and they have all sorts of people and leading academics and who knows, public figures, public intellectuals who give lectures. And Rosh Steinsaltz was asked to give a series of biblical essays, essays about biblical characters. He then did another series about Talmudic characters, and they're really fabulous. They always are written in a very, very sort of disarming style, because they're written very simply, and yet they have a lot of research and a lot of depth to them. So Rosh Steinsaltz notes indeed this, and he says, well, let's just take a look. He says, this apparently was Isaac's essential problem, to find his own place in a world dominated by the genius of his father. He did the only thing left for him to do. He carried on. And the task of the successor has always been one of the most unrewarding tasks of history. It has often been said all beginnings are difficult, but continuation can be even more difficult. The capacity to persist is no less important than the power to begin. Listen to this. In all the significant revolutions in history, it is evident the first generation, the revolutions themselves, or the founding fathers, usually have to struggle against formidable objective forces and circumstances. But the verdict of history concerning their success, whether it was a glorious victory or merely a passing episode, lies with their successors, the generation who have to fix and stabilize the revolution. And even if the founders are not always giants, the very fact that a person, a group, or a nation blazes a new trail endows them with superhuman stature. And yet it is the succeeding generation that has to bear the brunt of the worst of it, the backlash of the displaced old, and the relentless struggle against an unfamiliar new reality, all without the original zeal and ardor. Hence, one does not ascribe to the second generation the same glorious qualities that capture the imagination. The son's task is to hold steady and not create. Or as the Bible story puts it, they have to dig again the wells their fathers dug before them and have become blocked up. And therefore, let's go to the next paragraph. Isaac's task, therefore, if lacking in splendor or legendary exploits, is of ultimate value and significance. And the statement, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham begat Isaac, conveys the deeper meaning that although Abraham and Isaac may be worlds apart, and Abraham towers over Isaac both in personality and magnitude of his action, they're nonetheless together as one, Isaac not only justifying Abraham, but establishing him forever, etc., etc. In other words, what is Rosh Steinsaltz sort of saying here? Rosh Steinsaltz is saying that Yitzchak's copying Abraham, Yitzchak being a continuation of Abraham, is by design. It's not by default. It's not because Yitzchak was a weak character. In fact, one might even say, Ezeu Gibor, we say Yitzchak is Midat HaGvura, HaKoveshet Yitzro. Yitzchak would have liked possibly to be more creative, but what he did was, you can't have a tradition if every generation innovates. So he stayed in place and he continued Abraham's work. And he copied Abraham in order to create, he sort of anchored, stabilized Abraham, or put it differently, Abraham is Shacharit, the rising sun. Yitzchak is Mincha. We go to work and we make ourselves a to-do list, right? And we say, this is what we're going to do. And the afternoon is spent finishing up the things that we didn't get to do that morning. It's not creating new work. It's sort of, making sure that what I started this morning gets done and gets finished. That's Yitzchak. By the way, then Rosh Steinsaltz says, and this is beautiful, he said, and when we read in Toldot that Yitzchak had a special affinity for Esav sort of had a wild streak. Esav was a more flamboyant, outgoing character. He said Esav was the person that Yitzchak always wanted to be. Esav allowed himself a certain release that Yitzchak had never been allowed to, the luxury to exercise. And it was exactly that side of Esav which Yitzchak sort of found his connection to. So the passivity is if you want a heroic passivity, if we may say that, it's heroic in the sense that it's he's really establishing the tradition. Yitzchak ben Abraham holida Yitzchak. Now you might let me just share a passage just take this one stage further, because I mentioned Rosh Steinsaltz, but if you want to take a look, Rav Soloveitchik goes in a very similar direction. Let's see if I put Rav Soloveitchik. Yes, here it is. Rav Soloveitchik goes in a very similar direction here. And he is actually talking to a lot of Rav Soloveitchik's thought. We look at Rav Soloveitchik as a philosopher, but in many ways, I think he was a true leader of American Jewry, and he was very tied into some of the problems of America in the 1950s and 1960s, when Orthodox Jews weren't necessarily proud of their orthodoxy or their Shmirat Mitzvot. And he was trying to shoot for a greater sense of pride. I say this because I remember once talking to an educator at Maimonides' school, and I said, and he had taught there with the Rav, and I said to him, well, what was going on in the teacher's room about like women's learning Gemara, right? So he's, the Rav was instituted Gemara learning for women, but like, was there feminist talk? What was it? And he says, no, the Rav wasn't interested in that side of it. So I said, well, what was he interested in? So he made this very cryptic comment, and I'll explain it in a second. He said he wanted people to know that Judaism wasn't gefilte fish. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, let me explain. He said, when people came over from Europe, they thought that, like Shabbos was sort of like gefilte fish. In the old country, we ate gefilte fish and we ate cholent and we ate kugel, and we kept Shabbos. And now we're in America and we eat hamburgers and sushi. We also don't need to keep Shabbos. In other words, our grandparents spoke with Yiddish accents, but we speak with American accents. Our grandparents kept Shabbos and we don't. And he said when he taught Gemara, when he wanted to put Gemara at the center in Maimonides, he wanted people to understand that Hilchot Shabbat was robust. There's a logic, there's a system, it's systemic. If you've ever read the book Halachic Man, right? He talks about like it almost like being like a scientist. And he says that's why he loved teaching chulin, and he loved teaching things to do with Shmirot Mitzvot. He wanted people to understand that Judaism was robust and they should keep it. And in that regard, it was as much relevant to boys as girls, as men and women. It wasn't a question of he was teaching Gemara to teach people that Judaism was still relevant and was powerful and was a system. It wasn't just ethnicity, it was legal. The reason why I'm saying that is because you can almost see it here in this passage by Rav Soloveitchik from his book 5 Addresses, which are actually lectures to the Mizrahi organization, to the religious Zionist movement. And he actually talks about the fact that Yitzchak's got this interesting name. Yitzchak, he will laugh. And everything about Yitzchak's birth is about laughter, right? And he says Isaac's birth was connected with laughter. People laughed at the event. They didn't believe that Isaac would inherit Abraham, that he, a young lad of the new generation, would continue Abraham's visions and laws, and he'd also engage in building altars and calling the name of God. It's impossible to pass on Abraham's outlook, the mitzvot of Abraham, the statutes and laws to modern generation, to the young Isaac who fights with a rifle, works in laboratories, and thinks in modern categories of thought. And he says, when Abraham dies, people said, his entire philosophy will perish, his altars will be dismantled, his Shulchan Aruch will be eaten by moths, and all trace of his life will vanish. Just as the grass will grow over his grave. They all laughed. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, laughing. They didn't treat the event seriously. They didn't hate Isaac. They belittled him. They laughed. They derided. But they didn't hate. Years passed by, and those who wanted to laugh at Isaac and the hopes that Abraham pinned on him suddenly began to query and ask, is Isaac really sincere in his efforts to resuscitate Abraham's work? What's going on? They rubbed their eyes. Isaac was continuing with Abraham's enterprises. He was fighting for the same ideals, doing the same things his father has done. And Isaac dug the wells of water, which they dug up in the names of Abraham, his father, for the Philistines to stop them up. And look at the last paragraph. The same Gemara, the same Shulchan Aruch, the same Shabbat, the same laws of divorce. Who could have foreseen that the young modern Isaac would say that a divorcee is forbidden to a priest? That he would believe in the institution of Chalitza, that he'd demand a kosher kitchen or fight for religious education and the like? Who have guessed that he would speak with the same language that old Abraham spoke, as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, as the Ramah, as the Vilna Gaon, as Reb Chaim of Volozhin, and all of a sudden the laughter ceased. They stopped making jokes on Isaac's score and began to be jealous of him and to fight against him. In short, they ceased deriding and despising, and in their place came jealousy and hatred. So what Rav Soloveitchik's done is taken the sort of ideas of Rosh Steinsaltz, although sort of I think they developed them in parallel, but he's put it into sort of American 1950s, 1960s milieu, and he's saying, what does it mean to carry on the way of Abraham? It's not simple. It's not simple to blaze a trail and to be different. And it needs people. You might have Abraham, who was the Nasi Elohim. He was passionate, but the generations to come, will they be able to continue? Isaac is the great continuer. He's the great. So in this regard, I think both Steinsaltz and Ross Soloveitchik have sort of engaged in this. On the one hand, Isaac is the great continuer, but he's heroic in his action of doing it. He's persistent, he's tenacious. So this is one perspective of Yitzchak. And I got to say, I taught Yitzchak this way for many, many years, maybe when Ariella studied with me, and for many, many years. And I was quite happy with it. But over the years, I started becoming less happy because, let's face it, it's still a little bit, I don't know, how will I say? It's still a little bit, okay, great. So I'm continuing the tradition, but we value innovation. Isaac, you don't have an extra verse to add to the poem. Really, what does Yitzchak have to add? Is there really nothing? And I started wondering about this, and I went back to the parsha, and I realized that there was actually something quite powerful about Yitzchak, which I believe really talks to our moment in Israel here. So I'm going to go back to the biblical story and share this with you. Here we go. We're going to start verse 12. Verse 12. Okay, here we go. In the Hebrew. Vayizra Yitzchak ba'aretz hahi. Actually, I think I missed out a very important. No, I think we're okay. Yitzchak lives in the Negev. As we all know, the Negev is not exactly the most hospitable agricultural terrain. It's very harsh and very hard to grow things in the Negev. I happen to have like a little hobby of Israeli wines, and one of the wineries I'm into is a winery called Pinto, and the Pinto family made a winery in Yerucham. And when you listen to the winemaker, whose name is Yaakov Oriyah, he talks about how the wine is really influenced by the heat in the day and the cold at night of the Negev, and by the dry conditions. And he says, it really creates a unique wine. It's just not an easy terrain, and it's not easy to make good wine there, and it's a challenge. So it's amazing that Yitzchak, as we're going to see, fulfills sort of Ben Gurion's dream of, how should I say it, making the desert bloom. And I'm sort of going to claim that this is going to be part of his, secret power. So let's take a look. Pasuk Yud Bet. Vayizra Yitzchak ba'aretz hahi, ba'aretz hahu, vayimsa b'shana hi mea sha'arim, vayivarcheu Hashem. So first of all, I love it that Mea Sha'arim has got something to do with agriculture in the Negev. Isn't that sort of like an interesting one? But sorry, I wasn't intending to highlight that. Never mind. But so I can, yeah. So what's interesting is that Yitzchak is a farmer, and he has a yield of 100-fold. For every seed he puts in the ground, he takes out 100 seeds. He became really wealthy, right? And he had tons of herds and tons of sheep, and lots of slaves. So I even want to stop at this point and say that Yitzchak is maybe I'll stop sharing for a second. Yitzchak is a self-made man. It's interesting. He has all these flocks and servants and wealth. When Avram got his wealth, do you remember how Avram got his wealth? Avram got his wealth because he went down to Egypt, and Pharaoh took his wife, and when he had to return her, he gave Avram all sorts of, stuff. Yitzchak earns his own keep. Let me say maybe one more thing about this. It's Rabbi who says that the Avot represent three models as regard Eretz Israel. Abraham is the Oleh. He's born in Mesopotamia, and he makes Aliyah, and he spends the rest of his life in Israel. Yitzchak is the classic Av of Eretz Israel. He spends every day of his life. He never leaves the country, from the day he's born till the day he dies at age 180. He says, for a country to be a homeland, you have to be able to be born there, live there, and die there. Yaakov represents the third model. He's the classic Israeli. right? He's the backpacker, right? He grows up in Israel, then he leaves, goes to Mesopotamia for a while. He comes back, then he goes back to Chutz La'aretz because his kids are living there, right? Yaakov's the classic Israeli. He dies in Chutz La'aretz, and then his body's brought back after his death. So these are three really interesting models of relationships with Eretz Israel. But if you think about it, both Avram and Yaakov are shepherds. And when you're a shepherd, you are always a wanderer. We have Yaakov Ishtam, Yoshev Halim. And you could go with Rashi that this is Ohel Shel Shem Ve'ever, but more likely, an Ohel is what a shepherd uses, because a shepherd is always following where the grass is. And, if he lives in the Negev, so he might go to the middle of the country, in the spring or whatever it might be, right? We once went on a tiyul, and we met a Bedouin with his sheep, and my kids at the time were very little. And I said to him, we were near Bet Shemesh. So I said to him, where do you live? And he said, Beersheba. And I said to him, no, you mean Bet Shemesh? He said, no, Beersheba. I said, you walked with your sheep all the way from Beersheba to Bet Shemesh? He goes, no, I put them on a truck to bring them here. There's free grass here. And, a shepherd follows where the grass is, where the free grass is. A farmer, and shepherds, therefore, are nomadic. They're classically nomadic. Farmers are stuck in place. Farmer needs a field. He puts his house near his field. That's the classic farmer-shepherd tension. So Yitzhak is the only Av who's a farmer. He's stuck in place. And he has to grip the land in a way that neither Avram nor, neither. There's this midrash which says that Avram related to God as a mountain, and Yitzchak related to God as a sadeh, as a field, and Yaakov relates to God as a bait, as a house. Yitzchak, remember, Yitzchak went lasuach basadeh, right? Lasuach basadeh. He's connected to the fields. He's a farmer. I even find it interesting in this week's parsha when he smells Esav's clothes and he says, "Re'ei reach bani reach hasadeh," right? He loves the smell of the field, and Yitzchak is connected to agriculture, and he's the person who is really connected to the land. He never leaves the land of Eretz Israel, and that is his unique property. So if we take that, and now we go back, let's see his story, right? So he has tremendous yield. Now again, I think even just physically, now maybe we have to think about him differently. Instead of thinking what I imagined him before as a sort of feeble old man with dark glasses, sitting helpless, eating TV dinners, watching TV all day, right? Suddenly I've got to imagine him as sort of a chalutz with bulging muscles and with a suntan, with a kova tembel and with a mustache, it's just a whole different depiction of Yitzchak. And then when you read the story, you really get a sense of his tenacity. We said Yitzchak represents Gevurah. So let's take a look at that, because if we follow the story through, let's see what happens. I'm going to read it quite quickly. Hold on 1 minute. Some trouble here. Okay, we're great. So if you keep going, let's take a look at Pasuk Tet Vav, verse 15. And it says, Abraham had lived here. He'd made wells. Of course, you need wells in the Negev to make agriculture. You need to water your fields. And the Philistines had filled them up. And now, at a certain point, very interesting, right? Leave us because you've become far too strong for us. What does that mean? Maybe the local people are going to their chieftain, right, to Avimelech and saying, why can't you help us with agriculture? Like, Yitzhak looks so successful. Why is our economy in the dumps, right? Yitzhak is so successful that they're jealous of him, so they throw him out of town, which is wild. But let's see what happens. So he's thrown out of Gerar. He's thrown out of the city limits of Gerar. So what does he do? So he goes down the Nachal. So he digs the wells that he has rights to, and he starts working the land. But now look what happens in verse 19. Yitzchak's people, they dig in the Nachal and they find new water. It's Be'er Mayim Chayim. This isn't some subterranean aquifer. This is in fact a Ma'ayan, a new source of water. And there's a big argument because the local people, like the local Bedouin, the local Nachal Grar, they say it's our water. And he says, no, I dug it. It's my water. So they call that place Asek, Ki Tashkuimo. That means they call it controversy. Verse 21, they dug another one. And they argued about that one. And they called it Sitna, hatred. And then it says, Pasuk Chavbet. He moved a little further away and he dug another one. And this one they didn't argue about. And they called it Rechovot. Rechovot, right? They called it, Rechovot means broad, wide, expansive. We have been broad in the land and we have been fruitful. So in other words, what Yitzchak is, you can't move him. He digs in deep. Not only is he digging the deep subterranean waters, showing his deep connection to the land. I find it interesting. Yaakov has images of a ladder reaching the heaven. Yitzchak has images of wells reaching the depths. But he's really a person who continues to, he just can't be moved. And now let's take a look what happens next. Pasuk Chavav. Vavimelech, Pasuk Chavav, verse 26. Avimelech halach elav migrar. So Avimelech goes out from Gerar. V'achuzat mere'ehu. He brings some of his politicians. Ufi chol tzar tzva'o. This doesn't look so good, right? He's coming with his, politicians and with his army captain. And Yitzchak said, now look at Yitzchak. He's not a pushover. He says, Ma du abatem elai. Why are you coming to me? V'atem sneitem oti. You hated me. But teshalchuni meitchem. You banished me from you. And they say, verse 28. We've seen that God's with you. And we said, Tehina Allah beinotenu beinenu beinecha. We really think it's worthwhile that we should have a deal with you. It would be in our interests to make a pact with you. Now, why? Why is he doing that? Right? Look at what he says in verse 29. That you do us no harm, just as we have never molested you, and we've always been kind to you. First of all, they're lying through their teeth, but never mind. And we sent you away in peace, and so you be blessed of the Lord. Why are they coming? Why are they instigating a pact? By the way, this is a bit like Netanyahu's Middle Eastern theory. Make Israel successful enough, and then they'll come and make peace with you. Right? I would even argue more than that. I think they're threatened by him. They're worried that he's become so wealthy and so powerful that he will actually begin to threaten them. And they say, you know what? Maybe it's good that we should have a peace deal. And we will, they certainly realize he's not going anywhere. Which, by the way, again, is the story of Zionism in many ways, because, in 1948, the Arab states tried to wipe us out, and then again in 67, and then in 73. But suddenly, 78, Egypt's making peace with us. And there's a certain theory there. I attached to this source sheet a story by Agnon called Me'oyev Le'ohev. I don't know if anybody's seen it or studied it, but it's a story very much in this guise about how if we dig in and we plant and we build, eventually our enemies won't try and remove us, but they will actually try and make peace with us. Whichever way, it says they had a big feast, and early in the morning, verse 31, they exchanged oath, and Isaac bade them farewell. And that same day, Isaac's servants came and told him about a well they'd dug and said to him, we found water. And he named it Sheva, and that's why the city is called Beersheba till this day. Now, Avram had already called the city Beersheba, but look at Avram's story with Beersheba. Avraham, first of all, by the way, just if you take a look here, it's really interesting. Avram had already made a deal with Avimelech, right? God's with you. Make me an oath. Make me an oath that you will not deal falsely with me or my grandchild, or my son or my grandchild or my great-grandchildren. So really there should have been no tension between Avimelech and Yitzchak because they actually made a deal. But that's just by the way. But if you take a look here, it's really interesting because it says here, Avram took Sonu Bakar and he gave it to Avimelech and they made a covenant. And Avram takes 7 sheep and he says, what are these 7 sheep? And he says, these 7 sheep will be a sign of the pact. And Al Kain Karash Makomahu Beersheba. That's why they call it Beersheba. Why? Because of 7 sheep. What's more solid, 7 sheep or 7 wells? Avram got 7 sheep, you can slaughter a sheep. Yitzchak makes 7 wells. You can't move a well. I guess you can dig, you can fill it in, but do you understand? Yitzchak is deeply, deeply, deeply dug in. And in that regard, I started feeling that, by the way, I put the story, the Argonon story, it's on page, in a minute we'll maybe say something if we have time, we'll see. So I want to just say this, that when I started looking at Yitzchak in this way, I started seeing a different type of tenacity. And that Yitzchak, first of all, really grips the land. He clearly loves the land. He clearly finds something very passionate in farming. And maybe it goes with his personality. He likes being in a single spot. He's not the person who always goes to meet new friends. He's happy being in one place, stable, solid. And I find it just remarkable that he's able to hold his ground against a whole, Chabula, a whole tribe in the area, and just plugs away at it and shows them that, you think that I'll move away, like my father was always a nomad moving from place to place. Well, I'm not moving, and I'm going to be successful here. And eventually you're going to have to accept me as part of the landscape. And that maybe brings me back to the reason why 22 years ago, which was 2001, which was the years of the Second Intifada, I decided to call my son Hillel Yitzchak. It wasn't only because my grandfather's name was Yitzchak, but there was that Rosh Hashanah in the year 2000 when we finished Rosh Hashanah, and I had my sister staying with us and lots of guests, and over the loudspeakers in our yeshuv came they're shooting all around, the roads aren't safe, nobody's allowed to leave. And the crazy thing was, we were in the middle of a peace deal with the Palestinian Authority. We were in the middle of a peace process, and I said to myself, I don't get it. They almost have, Ehud Barak just offered them the whole of the West Bank. What more do they want? And suddenly it occurred to me that they actually just didn't want us here, right? And that's sort of been reinforced in the last month, right? That you can get out of the whole of Gaza. They're going to climb over the wall. They're going to knock down the fence, and they're going to come and slaughter and kill. And then we've got to show a lot of tenacity. Right, we've got to say, we insist on being here, and we have a right to be here, and we're just not going to move, and we're going to do whatever it takes for us to be here. And at the time, one of the things that I really felt was that I wanted to call my son Yitzchak, not only because of my grandfather, but because of Yitzchak Avinu, that I felt a desperate need to make a statement, me and my wife, obviously, to make a statement that we're going to dig in. And we're not going to, at the time, the roads weren't safe. At the time, we were actually driving to Jerusalem on a daily basis with bulletproof vests because there were drive-by shootings and what have you. And we said, we're here to stay. And that was my interpretation of Yitzchak. So I wanted to share that with you because I think, I don't know if we always see Yitzchak in that role. We see him as passive, as weak, and by the way, Ezel Gibor, right? Ezel Gibor HaKoveshet Yisrael. Right? Then the sense of Gvura is not necessarily Koveshet Yisrael, like Steinsaltz said, which was suppressing his creativity, right? But maybe conquering his fears, maybe just really being there in a sense of, having to hold his ground. That's the Gvura of Yitzchak. But I don't know if anybody wants to comment or add anything. So I'll just say maybe first of all two things. One, just connected to Yitzchak. I said if I had 2 more minutes, I'd share this little bit, which is I just can't resist doing this. Before I claimed, according to Robert Alter, that Yitzchak wasn't there in his wedding scene. The Yitzchak was absent and wasn't quite there when Eliezer or the Eved was finding a wife for him, but it's very interesting that the Midrash wants to actually claim something different. First of all, I always find it interesting that Yitzchak, that Rivka, they find Rivka is, discovered by the Eved by a well, and then when they come back, Yitzchak is also by a well, and Vayavo Yitzchak bo mi bo be'er l'chayroi v'hu yoshev be'eretz haNegev. He's already living in the Negev. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Right? According to the Ibn Ezra, by the way, he's walking in the fields. What's lasuach? He's not talking with God. He's not praying. He's talking to his workers. He's got lots of servants. He's talking to his workers. And if not Erev, at the end of the day, what did you plant today? What did you, whatever. So first of all, there's a fascinating symmetry of Yitzchak and Rivka. Rivka's by her well, and Yitzchak's by his well. And I love that symmetry. I always wonder, even according to Chazal, who say that he was praying, what was he praying for? Maybe he was praying that the shidduch should go well. Who knows? And then he sees and he meets Rivka. And then we have this scene of that Yitzchak, marries, brings her into his mother Sarah's tent. If you look at Rashi has a fascinating reading, and he says, "Bami bo be'er l'chayro." He understands "bami bo" that he's going backwards and forwards, that he's engaging in a sort of diplomacy there. And shahalach lavi Hagar la'Avraham aviv shisa'ena, that he went to bring Hagar back to Avraham, that Avraham should marry him. And I just find it very interesting. According to this, Avraham is worrying about a wife for Yitzchak, and Yitzchak is worrying about a wife for Avraham. There's some gorgeous symmetry going on here, and I'd say even more than that, Yitzchak is doing something brave because, of course, the only reason Hagar gets thrown out is because of Sarah and Sarah's very unique relationship with Yitzchak. And that's why Hagar gets thrown out. That's why Hagar got oppressed in the first place. That's why Hagar and Ishmael get thrown out. So Yitzchak has to overcome his past, his story, his chosenness, in order to be able to rebuild his relationship with Ishmael and Hagar. So first of all, I think that's another sign of bravery in a family sense. Okay, so I hope what I've done a little bit today, if I've done anything, is to sort of expand our understanding of Yitzchak, to expand our understanding of Yitzchak and put a bit more color in his cheeks, and to allow us to try and consider Yitzchak in a greater sense, and also maybe to reinforce that sense of Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, that sometimes there are moments in history where we channel the Avraham energy, the Chesed, where we channel the sense in which we can be generous and we can be very expansive, and we can try and build relationships across difference and reach out to people very much not like us. And then there are other times when we have to buckle down and really sort of hold our ground. So I feel like at the moment that's sort of one of those moments where we're actually being forced to show our gvura in some way, and we're being asked to sort of hold that moment. So in that regard, I think that's something which Yitzchak maybe is in the moment in that regard. People are asking for the document, but somehow I cannot.
You shared it with me, Rabbi Alex, so I can send it to Rachel.
Okay, so great. So Rabbanit Yael will send it out, and just want to say thank you. You should have a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much,
please
Rabbi
God,
Alex.
Thank you.
We should feel that everybody, both our soldiers and also all of the hostages or the abductees, should please God come back healthy and shalem, both in body and also in soul, in spirit. Please God, as soon as at all possible.
Amen.
Thank you.
This was beautiful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Alex.
Toda.
Thank you. Bye.
Look forward to seeing you at some point face to face.